Hi, welcome to Integrating Lived Experience, 3 approaches your organization can take. This is part of Co-Create's Learning Lunch series. It's the third of our learning lunches this month. If you'd like to see the recordings of the others, you can go to wearecocreate.com and you'll find them on there. They're also on LinkedIn, where we're live today, as well as YouTube Live. The idea of these learning lunches is that we cover big topics in a short space of time. So it's not about going into a lot of detail. It's more about bringing different ideas, techniques, perspectives from our work that you can take away and apply to your work. So the reason we've focused on LinkedIn Live is that it allows us to connect to each other, to ask questions, to make comments, and to keep this going after the session. So we're also on other platforms, and this recording will be available. But please, if you're on LinkedIn, use the comments, connect with me, connect with each other. And if you're watching a recording and you'd like to discuss anything that comes up, just get in touch with us. I'll share contact details at the end. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Co-Create, we were founded in 2016 with funding from the Department of Health. Since then, we've been working with public services of different kinds with a focus in health around all things involvement. So we're a collective of staff and freelance associates. We have lots of different backgrounds, but what connects us is our experience of involving the public in different ways. And many of us bring our own lived experience to our work. So for our topic today around integrating lived experience, I'll be bringing personal experience of working as an expert by experience, being outside the organization, coming in with my lived experience, and running an organization that employs people on the basis of their lived experience. And then more recently with Co-Create, sitting somewhere in between the two, where we aim to combine professional and lived experience. So a quick note on language before we jump into the topic. So you're going to hear the phrase lived experience a lot. What I'm describing here is the experience of people who are directly impacted by personal or social challenges. So this might include, for example, experience of discrimination on the basis of protected characteristics in the Equality Act, such as gender or ethnicity or sexual orientation or religious belief. It might be around caring for people. It might be around having a specific health condition or neurodiversity, many things, but they're all going to kind of connect in this one category. And I'm going to be talking about professional and lived experience roles. And I just want to clarify at this point, the focus is always on roles, not people, because in practice, professionals often have lived experience that informs their work, even if it's not something they feel able to kind of share more openly. People with lived experience often have professional experience they bring to their roles. So just thinking roles, not people, when we look through these things. So why do we want to involve lived experience? Why is it important? I'm going to go really quickly through this one because I'm assuming that those of you who are viewing already kind of start with a belief that lived experience is valuable. So a few things from our experience: we get more effective services that people are more likely to use and more likely to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve. We get better representation of diversity. So lived experience of different life challenges often creates a lot of barriers to employment. And by valuing lived experience, by explicitly valuing it as equal to but different from professional experience, we're able to get more diversity into organizations. Diverse perspectives produce better thinking. So if we have organizations where we kind of, where a lot of us have been there for a long time and we're used to thinking in a certain way together, it's really valuable to have these different perspectives come in. And we can create more rewarding workplace culture that everyone really benefits from, where we can kind of bring more of ourselves to the workplace. There's a really useful paper came out recently, and I just wanted to mention that, and it's about the different aspects of lived experience. So something that I've noticed often, so say we are recruiting for a role where we value professional experience, and that's a lot of the role, but we're also saying, lived experience would be important here too. What we often find is that professional experience is split into lots of different things. We might have our skills and our knowledge, and there's all these different aspects, and then there's kind of one line that describes lived experience, whereas there are many types of lived experience and they all bring different kind of values. So I won't go through all these. There's a link to the paper there, but just to mention a few of them, because they're just to highlight they're different to each other. So one is about embodied knowledge, the experience of having a condition. That's different to kind of knowing about the condition or empathizing with someone who has something. So it's what does it actually feel like to be there? Another distinct set of knowledge is navigational knowledge. So if you have, for example, a health condition, then that is something that forces you to find your way through services to get the kind of support that you're looking for. So that is a place where people can really provide a valuable, different perspective. It's very different overseeing how someone is referred to your service from the experience of being referred to your service. And one more to mention is cultural knowledge, where there are gaps in our organisational knowledge. Huge value to everyone just to bring in people with different sets of knowledge. So everything I'm going to be talking about today is around a 360 degrees approach to integrating lived experience. So the idea being that we value lived experience, we want to bring it into our organisation. We recognise that different roles support different people and that different purposes require different kinds of roles. So I want to think about all the different ways in which we can bring lived experience in so we can use as many of them as possible. And this graphic is just to illustrate a few different kind of categories of how we would bring people in. So one is where we have our organisation staffed by professionals. We have people outside the organisation with lived experience, and we engage with those people, involve those people in some way to bring their perspective into the organisation. Another way is that we bring lived experience roles into the organisation, so they're explicit lived experience roles, but they're now within our organisation. And then the third set of ways is where we blend professional and lived experience roles so that we're not making that really clear distinction, and we bring aspects of both into the same role in different ways. So all of these approaches support the others, and today is really an invitation to consider what areas you could maybe add to your current approach to using lived experience in your organisation. So a foundation to making those work, regardless of the type of role or which of those models we're working in, is creating a culture in which lived experience can thrive. So this is not necessarily the easiest thing. So I'm just going to acknowledge a few challenges, but in doing so, also saying that they are all addressable challenges. So the first thing is about inflexibility in large organizations. So I'll just illustrate this with personal experience. So I have chronic fatigue syndrome, long-term health condition, had it for 20 years. Initially, when I got ill, I wasn't really able to work very much, and I've worked up over the years the amounts I've been able to do. And so there was a time for a good few years where I was kind of able to work sort of 30, 35 hours a week, depending on the job, but I wasn't quite able to make it up to the standard 37 and a half. And it was really surprising how many organizations really struggled with that, and they had this really rigid kind of idea that the job would need to be done over 37 and a half hours, and they just couldn't make space for a 32-hour version of that role. So that's often a challenge when we're kind of looking at different things to support people with different kinds of needs. The second is that there's often a culture of reducing risk at the expense of impact. So it's really important, of course, to think about risks, but that can also prevent us from trying out different kind of approaches. And then finally, the idea of professionals and patients being different types of people. So I mentioned earlier that we want to think about roles and not people or categories of people. And what we can often find in health services, for example, is that we're used to this kind of model and power relationship where we have expert professionals and then patients who are kind of lacking in some way, and the patient tells the professional what's wrong, and the professional is able to fix it and send the patient away, hopefully feeling better. And that's a very different approach to thinking about patients as having other sets of experience, and they're different and neither can replace the other, but they're of equal value. And it can be hard sometimes to switch between those two kind of modes of relating to each other. So what might it look like if we have a culture in which lived experience can really thrive? So think about a culture that is open and reflective. So we're actively seeking new ideas rather than looking to continue business as usual. We reflect together and accept when things don't go as we plan. Actually, that's a really useful part of learning. We want to look towards a really inclusive culture where people share more of themselves than is currently normal in the public sector. So, for example, for me, with my health condition, sometimes that makes it more difficult to work. It doesn't stop me, but it can make it more difficult. And it's really helpful to let people know what's going on at the beginning. And what I've seen over lots of years of facilitation is that if we dive straight into business, it's hard for me or other people to share something kind of personal that is relevant and maybe affecting the way they are. Maybe it would help people understand how they are in that space if they knew. Whereas when we start something which is just very kind of more personal and inclusive of everyone, so maybe we start our meetings by inviting people to share anything that might make them less present at this time, it makes it a lot easier for people to share whatever kind of lived experience or life challenges are relevant for them in that space. So we want to develop a more inclusive working culture. And we want support from allies and leaders. So I think particularly what I'm getting at here is not having a situation where it's people with lived experience who have to forge their own path, which has been a lot of people's experience, is that they have their lived experience, they know it's important, but it's them who have to do all the driving in terms of encouraging people to allow it, never mind value it. So we need support from other people in the organization, especially from leaders. And how do we get there? So first we acknowledge that it's a big thing. This is a cultural shift. It takes time. It's very worthwhile, but it's not something we're going to turn around in a year, especially if our starting point is very limited inclusion of lived experience. So I find it really important to be honest about your starting point, and that's something that would be really good to do alongside people in your organization already who identify as having lived experience. Put support in place before implementation. So what I mean there is that we don't jump straight into encouraging people to share their lived experience, bringing in new people on the basis of their lived experience before we've got some support in place. And value the lived experience in your organization. So think about what is there already. So in our work, we do a lot of work around co-production or involvement, supporting health organizations to go out and engage with different people, communities, groups who they need to know more about, for example. And what we've found is that often, so diversity is a big issue in this kind of thing. People often find they're not really able to engage with a diverse group of people. And sometimes we find that we're working with organizations that are internally very diverse and struggling to be diverse in their engagement, and really not kind of finding or making the most use of the value of lived experience in their organization. So I really encourage you to to see what is there already. Ask people who might have ask everyone if they feel they have lived experience that's relevant to your work, if they would like to share that more, what would help them to share that more. Those kind of questions to really start with what you have already. So it's a big topic. I'm just going to refer you to New Philanthropy Capital, who are a think tank who support charities, have produced some work around centering lived experience. There's a link in the slides there. You can obviously Google it to access it. They go into some more details there. It's focused on charities, but it's also really useful for public sector organizations. So next step is thinking about creating diverse lived experience roles. So there's many types of lived experience role. This isn't meant to be a full list, and please use comments to add in more ideas that you have, but just a few that I'd like to mention. One is internal experts by experience. So what I mean by that is that often in involvement, for example, we have experts by experience who are kind of outside the organization, but brought in periodically to tell us how they think about certain issues and so on. Now, that's something that sometimes is really helpful to bring into the organization, have people on payroll, have them a bit more part of the organization as a whole. I know for me, when I was brought into a local authority that I was doing expert by experience work for, it was really powerful. You know, suddenly I was being employed by a local authority to use my own experience to support other people, and it was useful for me career-wise as well. Second category, peer support kind of roles. So roles where people use their own lived experience to support others. There's community engagement lead type roles where people who have experience of being part of a certain community, knowledge about that community and so on, become part of your organization, support you to connect, especially with communities that you're not managing to connect well with. And then finally, I'd like to suggest that lived experience can be a valuable addition to any role. Like, it doesn't need to be the primary emphasis of the role, but it might be worth looking at whether this is a desirable additional bit of experience for any of the roles in your organization. A few considerations. This is not a full list, and please add your own. But when we're thinking about lived experience roles, some things to be aware of. None of these are easy, but again, all things we can work with. One is isolation within the organization. So it can feel a bit weird when you're like one of a few people who have these kind of lived experience roles that are very separate from everyone else's professional roles. So it's really worth thinking through how you can connect people into the broader team, not make that really clear distinction between two types of roles. Clarify the risks to those taking on those roles. So obviously, using your lived experience in a professional environment can be challenging. Risks bring difficult things up and so on. It can be really rewarding as well, but it's important to be clear what those risks are in your context and be able to communicate that to people you might be inviting to use their lived experience. Consider career progression. So this is something that comes up a lot for lived experience roles in organizations, which is that we tend to have we'll have one path for professional roles and one path for lived experience roles. And the lived experience roles tend to start quite junior and usually not go very far, not exclusively, but it's a really common issue that there's not that much space for development, for career progression. And the paths are so separated that it's very difficult to move from a lived experience role across to a professional role where there might be more opportunity. So there's not a really easy thing to solve, but over time we want to work towards either kind of blurring those distinctions so that you have more roles that are both professional lived experience roles. Maybe there's providing additional training for people in lived experience roles to open up more of the professional roles. Lots of ways to go about that, but definitely something that's worth considering from the outset. And I just wanted to mention here, Co-Production Collective and North London Mental Health Partnership have done some great work recently on peer worker community of excellence. So again, Googleable, and I've linked to that in the slides if you want to find out a bit more about peer workers and support and that kind of area. So finally, wanted to look at recruiting for lived experience. So this is going to cover any of these lived experience roles. So from kind of periodic engagement from someone who's very much outside the organization to peer worker community engagement lead roles, and also recruiting for roles that might have more emphasis on the professional, but are inviting people who also can bring the value of lived experience. So a few questions if you're embarking on recruitment to ask yourself right at the beginning. The first is, why do you want this experience? So and I'm imagining a lot of you here, believe that it's the right thing to do, but that's not necessarily clear or specific enough, and certainly not clear or specific enough a message to share with people who are potential candidates. So it's worth being clear specifically why you want this experience for this role, for your organization. So, maybe you've identified gaps in knowledge or experience in your organization, or you feel people would perform this role better if they had a specific type of lived experience. So the second is what specific lived experience you're looking for. So I think sometimes roles can get a bit vague where it's more of a generic patient or public contributor, or those kind of roles where it's not clear which elements of people's lived experience and lived experience of what are important. So I really want to be able to define what the experience people have is that you want, and also thinking back to that the 6 types of patient knowledge, thinking of which types of those experience start to break it down. So we're not just saying we want you to have lived experience of this health condition, we're saying we want you to have experience of navigating services around this, and so on. And then finally, think about which ways of working are really essential. So often when you look at a person specification for a job, there's a really big list of essential characteristics, often more than you can really write meaningfully to in an application form. And very often the successful candidate won't be really strong on every one of 20 or more of those characteristics. So it's really helpful to think about which of those are really important, and also to think about which ways of working are essential. So say we're making decisions around whether a role might be a remote role or a hybrid role, or it's all on site. We want to think about what's really essential. We might prefer people to be on site all the time, but could they do this if they were at home half the time or all the time? And really kind of strip things back so that we're only focused on what's essential to keep our opportunities as open as possible. Want to think about the messaging as much as possible. So tell people why you want their lived experience. It's much more, well, it's helpful on a job advert to be able to say we welcome applications from people with these characteristics. It's far more helpful if you can start to get into the specifics I was talking about and tell people how that is going to support the organization, what specific experience you want, and so on. I'm going to be clear about the terms and support available for the job from the outset. So again, this is guided by my personal experience of applying for jobs, and also experience of recruitment within Co-Create, where so when I'm applying for a job and I might need, for example, to have slightly reduced hours, it's a really difficult starting point to have to get in touch and say, kind of, can you match these different needs I have, rather than getting in touch and saying, I'm really excited about this role, I have these skills, is that the kind of fit you're looking for? So wherever possible, really set things out so that you're not putting up extra barriers for people with lived experience. And finally, choose recruitment channels that show who you want to hear from. So if there's a specific set of people that you want to hear from, a specific type of lived experience, think about how you might get in touch with those people specifically. Is there some kind of a channel? You know, maybe it's a social media channel, maybe there's a magazine, maybe there's a network of people, maybe there's a charity that supports people with that kind of lived experience. Think about ways that really show people that they are the people that you want to hear from. And then finally, when you think about your assessment process, one thing, and so a lot of this slide is really drawn from Co-Create's work on our recruitment process. We are, of course, a short session, so I won't get into lots of detail, but there's a link to 2 blogs there. Again, you can find that on our website, wearecocreate.com, and they get into a bit more detail about our experience. But a few things to consider. So the first is considering the kind of barriers that people with lived experience might have to applying to these posts. So there's some very practical things. You know, they might be about language, they might be about experience in writing applications, might be about the amount of time someone has around fitting around caring, responsibilities, work, and so on. There's also a whole set of psychological barriers that people might bring. So, for example, there's some often quoted research about comparing men and women looking at a person's specification for a job, and on average, they find that if men looked at a job and thought that they met 60% of the requirements, they'd think they had a good chance at the job and they would apply, whereas the women who looked at the job would feel that they would need 100% of those characteristics to feel able to apply. So only one study, but I think it illustrates a broader point. If people are kind of less confident, if they've experienced discrimination in the past, this whole process is going to be harder. So we want to make it as straightforward as possible, and kind of bearing that in mind when we're designing our assessment processes. So a big part of that is keeping the person specification minimal. So thinking about what is really essential, what can we strip out? So when we've been working through this at Co-Create and kind of stripping them down, and it is difficult because everything feels important. But we kept asking ourselves the question: if we were to meet someone who seemed really great for the job, but they couldn't do that thing, would they still be the right person for the job? And that really helped kind of guide through narrowing in as much as possible. Second thing is thinking about, are you assessing what's important? So it's very easy to slip straight into, we're recruiting, so we're going to have some kind of written application, then a panel interview, and that's how we will decide. What we can often end up assessing there by mistake is how good someone is at writing an application form, how good someone is at talking about themselves in interview. And over a few rounds of recruitment, found something really interesting in our practice at Co-Create, which was that actually there wasn't a strong correlation. There was almost a negative correlation between how well someone spoke about their ability to facilitate, which is a core skill at Co-Create, and how well they performed it in practice. And so we moved all those things out of the interview process and into an observation where we asked people to facilitate us a short session on a topic we gave them, and we reflected together. And we found that not only was it easier for people who might struggle with interview processes, for example, but it helped us cut straight to what was important. So lots more I could say on that, but I'm aware of time. So do have a look at those blogs if you're interested in finding out more. And do get in touch if you would like further support around anything that's come up today. So Co-Create offer consultancy, training, facilitation. If you'd like to just have a chat about how we could support you, connect with me on LinkedIn, email us at info@wearecocreate.com. And that is it for today's session. So this was the 3rd of August Learning Lunches. If you go to our website, which is linked to on this slide, you can view the recording of this will be up soon, and the recordings of the other sessions are already there. Thank you for being with us, and I look forward to seeing you next time.